What could be scarier than a spider-infested or haunted house? There's a serial killer on the loose in your city. Some serial killers not only kill their victims, but also do other terrible and shocking things. Here are the most brutal serial killers. One of the most well-known and wiretapped serial killers lived in the East End of London in the 1800s. His true identity remains a mystery even today, and although there are multiple suspects, there are still many unknowns about this serial killer. He is suspected of killing more than 100 people, but he has 5 best-known murders. Journalists at the time called him the Wow Chapel Killer or Leather Apron. Now let's go back to the 1800s and better understand the world in which this serial killer committed murders. The East End of London was a place of poverty, squalor, and crime. It probably smelled really bad. Jewish and Russian immigrants moved there hoping to create a better life for themselves, and the area became quite populated. This situation became widespread, and there were many brothels offering sexual services to men. Jack the Ripper's victims were all women working in these brothels, and in August 1888, the horrific murder spree began. He didn't just kill his victims, he butchered them. He slaughtered his victims so gruesomely that many people concluded that he had an extreme hatred of women. Additionally, the killer must have been a police surgeon or butcher. It was concluded that it must have been because he slaughtered his victims with great skill, some of them at least 100. He says he killed him. American serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer differed slightly from Jack the Ripper in his choice of victims. She preferred African American men, whom she found in shopping malls, bus stops, and bars. He killed 17 people between 1978 and 1991. So how did he attract them? He endeared himself to his victims by initiating deep conversations with them and made them come to his house by offering them money or sex. At home, he would give them alcoholic drinks laced with drugs. However, while an ordinary murderer would immediately try to dispose of bodies, Jeffrey Dahmer was no ordinary person. After killing his victims, he would use the corpses for his sexual pleasure, then dismember and dispose of them. Dahmer was not an emotional man. He would keep the skulls or genitals of his victims as souvenirs. As he gained more experience, he began experimenting with corpses. He would sometimes eat the flesh of his victims and attempt a lobotomy. Before killing his victims, he would puncture their skulls and inject hydrochloric acid. He would also take photographs of his victims at different stages of the murder and document them so he could look back at them later. Eventually, he was caught and arrested on July 22, 1991. He was murdered by another prison inmate, Christopher Scarver, in 1994. I began to notice a similarity between these murderers. The first was a killer who thought he was a surgeon, while this man was a real doctor and liked killing his victims with injections. Before we get into the subject, let's talk a little about Harold Shipman's life. He was born in 1946 and was his mother's favorite child. They had a very close relationship, so he was devastated when his mother was diagnosed with lung cancer and died. He was left alone, but still determined to succeed. He went to Leeds University and studied medicine. He later married and had 2 children. Sounds like an average, successful guy, right? Unfortunately, it wasn't like that. Throughout his career as a medical professional, his patients trusted him. But a funeral home worker noticed that his patients were dying at an abnormally high rate. They also all died in similar ways, fully clothed and in a sitting position. It was later discovered that Shipman may have killed at least 360 of his patients by injecting them with lethal doses of painkillers. He was arrested in 1998 thanks to the determination of Angela Woodruff, the daughter of one of his victims. His mother had overdosed on morphine 3 hours before her death. With an old typewriter, Shipman falsified the woman's will and wrote that she left most of her property to herself. He hanged himself in prison in January 2004, so at least we don't have to worry about him anymore.